Hello students, welcome to Chapter 3, Lesson 4. Today we're talking about the Southern Colonies. That means Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So let's get started. We already learned about Jamestown in the beginning of the Virginia colony. And after those first few rough winters, the colony really started to grow. There was a high demand for labor, and as a result, the first 20 slaves from Africa came to Virginia aboard a Dutch ship in 1619. We'll learn a great deal more about the slaves throughout the rest of the course, and ultimately how they're all freed at the end of the Civil War, over in marking period 3. Not only were slaves from Africa brought over to work, but prisoners of war as well, and criminals. Often these undesirables were forced to work for 7 years, then they would earn their freedom. Indentured servants were kind of like slaves in a fashion. They were workers that essentially agreed to work for free for a period of time, typically some years, in exchange for passage to America. Now, Maryland is an interesting story. It was the dream of a guy named Sir George Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore. Calvert was a Roman Catholic and wanted a nice place for his fellow Roman Catholics to live. You remember that over there in England, they had this new church called the Anglican Church, and they weren't always very nice to people that weren't also Anglican. So King Charles of Britain gave Calvert a swath of land north of Virginia. That would become Maryland. Unfortunately, Calvert died right after receiving this large grant of land, and his son Cecil would oversee the colonization of what he named Maryland. And there he is, Cecil, the new Lord Baltimore. So Cecil sent his 2 brothers to oversee the colony. He also gave large tracts of land to the English, aristocrats, like the rich ruling class, as well as some settlers. Maryland grew, and so did its need for labor. Slaves and indentured servants were sent to the new colony. Fun story, the Penn family and the Calvert family fought over the Maryland-Pennsylvania border for years, and it was not settled until they hired Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to map the border, hence the name, the Mason-Dixon line. Religion was also a source of tension in Maryland. Calvert originally wanted a safe place for his fellow Catholics. Maryland welcomed all Protestants and Catholics, but to ensure fair treatment for the minority Catholic population, the colony established the Act of Toleration of 1649. This was superseded years later by the establishment of an official state religion, which was Protestant, in 1692, which ended up forcing the same restrictions on the Roman Catholics that they had left England for in the first place, and it is likely that the original Lord Baltimore likely rolled over in his grave. That's irony right there. Maryland had problems, but so did their neighbors to the south, Virginia. Virginia was growing rapidly, and as more settlers came, they spread west into native lands. Governor Berkeley had made a deal with the natives. In exchange for a large chunk of land, the settlers would go no further west. He was trying to stop a war from happening between the settlers and the Native Americans. Well, there was a young planter living on the western side of Virginia who didn't care much for that deal. And he really didn't fancy this man in eastern Virginia making rules for people in western Virginia. There were also incidents of violence between the Indians and settlers. Nathaniel Bacon, and what would become his army, felt Berkeley was ignoring them. As a result, Bacon raised an army, attacked native villages, and then marched on Jamestown, burning it to the ground. It was looking like Bacon was going to take over the colony, but then he suddenly died of dysentery, which is pretty gross. And there he is, Bacon getting things done, burning Jamestown to the ground. That brings us to Carolina and Georgia. The 2 Carolinas were originally one Carolina. It was begun in 1663. King Charles gave the colony to 8 nobles that set up estates or rented land to settlers. John Locke, a famous philosopher, actually wrote a constitution for the colony. Carolina ended up splitting into 2 distinct colonies. North Carolina was settled by many from Virginia. They grew tobacco and sold tar and timber. They had to use Virginia, though, to send their goods abroad because there were no good natural ports in North Carolina. In South Carolina, they grew rice and indigo. Rice required a great deal of labor and brought in more slaves. South Carolina had its own good port at Charleston. North and South Carolina actually ended up becoming royal colonies in 1729. Indigo is a crop used to make blue dye. You'll read that in the text. Georgia is a different story. Georgia was the last of the established colonies. It was set up by a man named James Oglethorpe in 1733 as a place for debtors to get a fresh start. These people owed a lot of money and would otherwise be in jail. It didn't quite go as Oglethorpe had planned, however. A lot of poor people moved to Georgia, but not a lot of debtors. They also didn't care much for Oglethorpe's rules, like no slaves or rum. No rum. Oglethorpe eventually gave in their demands, and he also ended up surrendering the authority of the colony to the king. And Georgia became a royal colony in 1751. The Crown was interested in the location of Georgia. It served a strategic purpose as kind of like a border state between the English colonies and Spanish-controlled Florida, and as such, there were fortresses built to prevent and discourage attacks. And your quiz for the day is nothing crazy. 10 points. There's some matching in there, one true or false, and a couple of multiple choices. You get 2 attempts. If you did anything, let me know. I'm here for you.